This webinar is organized by Development and Peace, Caritas Canada, and I'm Kelly Domenico, Director of Communications and Campaigns at Development and Peace. It's also being organized by the Canadian Religious Conference and as well the Global Catholic Climate Movement Canada, which you'll be learning a bit more about later on. So this webinar is to celebrate the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si, which was published on May 24th, 2015. And this week is Laudato Si week. So there's actually events happening all over the world, which is really exciting to celebrate this landmark encyclical. So before we get started, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to be doing a land acknowledgement on the land where I am today, but please, I would invite you to acknowledge the territory that you are on. So the land where I am today is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, also known as the Mohawks. This territory is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. And I would now invite you to just take a moment to acknowledge the territory from where you are joining us today. So right now we are about 180 participants. What we'd like to do is just do a little survey to get started so that we know a bit where everyone is from. And while you answer the survey, I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping regarding Zoom. So we're going to launch the survey now. So you can fill it in, and then at the end, we can look at the results. So just to let you know, with the webinar today, there will be a Q&A period at the end. Please write your questions and answers in the Q&A box. We won't be using the chat box today, so please really focus on the Q&A box. We're also broadcasting live on Facebook, so if anyone is watching us on Facebook, you can write your questions there, and we'll make sure to try to integrate them and answer them at the end of the webinar. So each of our panelists is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then, like as I mentioned, we'll have the Q&A and have some final remarks at the end. So should we end the poll here? So I think everyone has answered more or less. So we have 9%, well, as you can see, people can see the results. 9% of our participants are in BC, 9% in Alberta, 7% Saskatchewan, 6% Manitoba, 55% in Ontario, 4% in Quebec, 9% in the Maritimes. We even have someone joining us from the Yukon or Nunavut or Northwest Territories. And I'll just ask that, okay, can we scroll down a bit more? Okay, so we have quite a lovely representation today from across the country, which is very exciting. So many different time zones represented also. So I think we can stop sharing the results and we'll get started. So as you know, 5 years ago, Pope Francis published his encyclical Laudato Si. In it, Pope Francis really addresses the multiple crises that are facing humanity today. And not only does he show how all of these crises are interconnected, but at the root of these problems are really broken relationships. And he calls for an ecological conversion and describes to us what he sees as an integral ecology. And these broken relationships are with God, with Mother Earth, and with one another, really. And these relationships will always be broken as long as we don't keep the most bruised and suffering of our world close to our hearts. And that includes our environment. In the encyclical, he says, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And today, this is what we're really going to reflect on is how do we hear those cries? At Development and Peace, for over 50 years, we've been trying to restore and nurture the relationships that Pope Francis speaks of in his encyclical, and especially with our sisters and brothers in the global south. Our solidarity as Canadians is really key to healing the wounds of our world. And since the release of the encyclical, Development and Peace has been responding to it in different ways. First and foremost, through our work with our partners in the Global South, who really guide us and ask us to walk with them in their struggles for justice and in protecting their dignity, livelihoods, territories, and culture. As well, Development and Peace does education and advocacy work here in Canada. And in 2015, not long after the release of the encyclical, we had a campaign called Create a Climate of Change. And that's where we really asked for strong and ambitious targets in the Paris Agreement, and especially for Canada. As we know, it's the most poor and vulnerable who are affected the most by climate change, even though they've contributed the least to it. We've also been working for a very long time on corporate social responsibility, and we ask that Canadian businesses respect human and environmental rights, and this is something that Pope Francis addresses very much in the encyclical. And this year, inspired by the synod on the Amazon that was announced by Pope Francis, we launched a campaign called For a Common Home, A Future for the Amazon, A Future for All. And this synod it's really Pope Francis putting into practice Laudato Si. And so our campaign looked at the region of the Amazon, how it is being threatened, how its people are being threatened, and seeing how we can respond to that, especially since this region of the world is essential for the well-being of all of humanity. And now in this period of COVID, which we're all experiencing and which really shows, I believe, our fragility as a human family, but a fragility that if we come together will only make us stronger. We've seen that human dignity and our common home can never again be put second to profit. As we emerge from this, we really need to think of other ways of living. And I think Laudato Si has become more relevant than ever and gives us hope in this new path forward. And as Pope Francis says, humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. And I think our panelists today are going to show us many different ways that we can do that together, and different possibilities that come out in Laudato Si. So we're going to begin with Stephen Bede Scharper, who's Associate Professor of Environment at the University of Toronto and a columnist with the Toronto Star. He has authored several books that explore environmental ethics, ecology, religion, and sustainability. And most recently, he has co-edited the forthcoming book, The Green Bible, Words of Love for a Suffering Creation, which he co-edited with Simon Apolloni, who's a former animator at Development and Peace. I think you're going to see many interconnections today between all of us here together. And this book will be published by Novalis. So I will now give it over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It's great to be with you all here. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. It's a real pleasure to join this group here and celebrate the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. I think in the future, this document will be the North Star of Catholic social thinking on the environment. And as an encyclical, it won't be shelved. It is part of the tradition of the magisterial teaching of the Church. So it will always be there as a reminder to take creation in loving seriousness. As Kelly mentioned, I teach environmental studies at the University of Toronto, as well as religious studies. And when talking about the environment in terms of loss of biodiversity, climate change, floods, and tragedies, it can get very depressing. So it's always important that we not lose our sense of humor. So often I try to have an attempt at humor when going through some of the Slough of Despond that is environmental studies. And this one has a papal tinge to it. So we all recall the discovery of the Higgs boson particle, the so-called God particle, which hit the scene in 2012. It's an underlying dimension of all matter. Well, apparently during that time, the Higgs boson particle decided to go to the Vatican and wanted to go to the church. And the Pope at the time saw Higgs boson and said, "Excuse me, Higgs boson, you can't receive communion because you're not a Catholic." And Higgs boson replied, "But Your Holiness, without me, you can't have Mass." I can hear the muted groan zooming at me. My apologies. We are all going through something that very few of us have experienced, a global pandemic. The COVID-19 tumult has led to incredible disruption, suffering, stress, and a rethinking, it is hoped, of our time. As we begin this conversation, focusing on Laudato Si, I just want to acknowledge that all of us are going through very rough seas, some much more tempest-tossed than others. And I thought we'd just take a half minute just to take a few deep breaths, to fill our lungs and breathe deeply and exhale, and think of the exchange that we have with the rest of the creative world, that reciprocity of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the human family to the trees and the oceans, and just allow that to fill our lungs and to fill our thoughts just for a couple of seconds. And if you happen to be outside or near a window and listening to birdsong, think of that song of spring. And we're reminded of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962, which reflected on a world bereft of birdsong because landscapes had been laced with baleful DDT and other pesticides. This spring, with a muted fossil-fueled economy, we have heard birdsong in vibrant tones, an imagination and a listening that the Pope invites us to deeply reflect on spiritually. What might those voices of nature be telling us in this time of crisis? In my brief remarks today, I just have 3 words that I'd like to unpack. The first is impact. It's important to remember, I think, that Laudato Si was part of a triptych, as it were, as Pope Francis helped prepare the table for the major Paris summit on climate change sponsored by the United Nations. As Kelly mentioned, this document came out in May before the meetings in December, but it was followed by a meeting with President Barack Obama in the United States, a joint meeting of Congress to which the Pope spoke, and also a speech to the United Nations. What the Pope attempted to do, and I think was successful in doing, was through these events and this document, make climate change a primary moral and spiritual issue. Not simply an issue of policy, not simply an issue of economics, but a fundamentally important spiritual and moral issue. I was in attendance at the climate change meetings in Paris and had the opportunity to interview some of the delegates from various countries. One of the Latin American delegates said what the Pope had done was make it a moral imperative to reach an agreement at Paris. If we failed, it wasn't only a failure of politics, it was a failure of moral leadership. And that is one of the great impacts of Laudato Si. Also, as mentioned, the notion of integral ecology, a listening to the cry of the marginalized and poor of the earth in the human family, and a cry of the earth, particularly the marginalized in the earth. Species that are forced into extinction, ecosystems that are suffering, whole glacier landscapes that are melting. The Pope in this document has achieved something that David Suzuki, the Dean of Canadian Environmentalists, has found deeply moving. On the 25th anniversary of the Suzuki Foundation, David Suzuki was speaking, and Laudato Si had recently been published. And he said, "I have read this document 3 times. Each time I read it, I weep. The Pope has combined social justice and affirmation of climate science with beautiful lyrical prose. We should have written this document." Standing next to me was Amy Hugh, a former student now working at the Suzuki Foundation. She leaned over to me and said, "Stephen, for him to say that, that's a big deal. He's an atheist." A number of scientists have spoken about how important Laudato Si has been for their work. As their climate science has been denigrated, they've been threatened in many cases, and their work disparaged. Here, a leader on an international scale of tremendous authenticity has affirmed their work and taken it into a moral, ethical, spiritual realm. Many have breathed a sigh of relief from the scientific community because he had done that. Just an example to share with you from the document where Pope Francis talks about loss of biodiversity. This is paragraph 33. He writes, "It is not enough, however, to think of different species merely as potential resources to be exploited, while overlooking the fact that they have value in themselves. Each year sees the disappearance of thousands of plant and animal species which we will never know, which our children will never see, because they have been lost forever. The great majority become extinct for reasons related to human activity. Because of this, thousands of species will no longer give glory to God by their very existence, nor convey their message to us. We have no such right." This impact has been expressed around the world and around Canada in many numerous initiatives, programs, graduate degrees, and workshops, and workbooks, and webinars. It continues. A small sampling. At Oxford University and Campion College, there's now a Laudato Si Institute, headed up by eco-theologian Celia Dean Drummond. The Diocese of Granada in Spain has set up a Laudato Si Symposium and Permanent Institute to inculcate the values from Laudato Si. And certificates and graduate programs throughout the university establishments in the United States and Europe and in Canada have come forth as a result of this document, showing that this is continuing in the reflective centers of the world as an important statement. In addition, here in Canada, numerous groups, such as Development and Peace, the Mary Ward Center, and the Jesuit Forum for Social Faith and Justice, have picked up the challenge of this encyclical and shared it through guidebooks, through seminars, through presentations, and helped in English and French to express some of these core values that are coming out of the document, particularly for our young people to reflect on. Some of the other manifestations of this have been outside the realm of the Catholic Church. Elizabeth May, for example, the Green Party leader, has stated that Laudato Si is one of the most important pieces of writing for our civilization in decades. Also, we had the former Environment and Climate Change Minister, Christine McKenna, who would often speak with and to Pope Francis about his views on the environment. And in 2018, 600 US Catholic organizations declared they still support the Paris Agreement, and they reached out to political leaders in their country to have them support it. We will probably hear more about this later from the other distinguished panelists. On a local level, at the high school level, this has been taken to heart. The Saskatchewan Catholic School Boards Association, along with the Ontario Catholic School Trustees Association, have produced summaries of this document for their programs and their schools. Two examples of how this is being implemented. St. Mike's Elementary School in Burnaby, BC, has created a vegetable garden for students to tend to as one way to respond to Pope Francis's call for caring for our common home. And Holy Cross Regional Secondary School in Surrey, BC, has also created a vegetable garden, but it's coordinated it with a fair trade market and also the biology program. This is an area where the Syrian Refugee Project also has worked through a recycling program and food distribution program. Again, the social dimensions of the ecological thrust. There are numerous examples of how this has instantiated itself across Canada and the world. A second word, pushback. As soon as this document was released, Jeb Bush in the United States, who at the time was running for president, who was also a Catholic, said, "I take my science from scientists, not the Pope." Also, James Inhofe, who was at that time chair of one of the science committees in the Senate, said the Pope should stick to morals and ethics and leave economics and these issues to the politicians. This has continued with critiques of the papacy and of Pope Francis in particular. And this is indicative of the nerves that he has stepped on and the sensitivities he has roused by this integrative critique of our consumer culture, which leaves millions of people hungry and destitute, as well as large swaths of our ecosystems in rags. This is the combined integral ecology that is a critique of our business as usual, fossil fuel-based economy. And this gets into the issue of worldview. The Pope is asking us to, in a sense, fall in love with creation. St. Francis, his namesake, is no longer seen as an interesting and cute lawn ornament that birds can drink from in the backyard. St. Francis has been brought front and center, not as some oddity, but as an exemplar of how we are to live our lives, in loving, creative joy with the poor and the beauty of creation. And that leads to the third word, gobsmacked. The Pope writes, "Rather than a problem to be solved, the world is a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise." Toward the end of his encyclical, he writes, "Let us sing as we go. May our struggles and concern for this planet never take away the joy of our hope." End quote. Joy, hope, song. These are the three companions on this new journey that the Pope has invited us to. It is not all about hair shirts, sackcloth, sacrifice, and ashes, though challenging times and changes of behavior lie ahead. It's also about embracing the celebratory beauties of this creation and of the universe, and trying to discern how the Spirit, who appeared to the ancient Israelites as a wisp of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, is now speaking to us and leading us to care for our common home. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I think you really helped us see the links that Laudato Si has made globally. And I think one of the things that was very particular about Laudato Si when it was published is it's an encyclical addressed to all people of good faith and not just Catholics. And I think you really helped show very concrete examples of that. And thank you for helping us reconnect with nature at the beginning, which Laudato Si is very much about, of rediscovering, as you said, the beauty of creation. We're going to go now to Sister Sue Wilson. Sister Sue is a sister of St. Joseph of Canada, and she helps to run the Office for Systemic Justice of the Federation of Sisters of St. Joseph of Canada. She's worked a lot on extractive issues, both here in Canada and overseas. And I know she's involved in many, many networks, including Kairos and as probably many of you know, the religious communities have been working a long time on ecological justice, even before Laudato Si came out. So I'm very anxious to hear from you, Sister Sue, on how this encyclical changed or helped the religious communities in their work on ecological justice.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you. So I was asked to say a little bit about what religious communities are doing, and I should say off the top that I won't even try to cover all of the different things religious communities are doing for ecological justice. I think instead, I just want to highlight 4 areas which religious orders in which they've been active. So the first one would be spirituality. I think for decades there have been ecological retreats and conferences, which over the years have led to new understandings of how we're in relationship with God, with Earth, and each other. For instance, whether it's in our prayer or communal documents or public statements or even collective actions, we're seeing a growing sense of the sacredness of all creation, the interconnectedness of life, a concern for the impact of human systems on bioregions and all their inhabitants. And I'd say second, I'd point to the ways that we're being changed by our relationships with Indigenous persons and communities. I think through these relationships, our assumptions and even our sense of history are challenged. Our eyes are open to racist structures in our society. We're getting a deeper understanding of the need to decolonize our hearts and minds if we hope to be effective in a deeper transformation for ecological justice. I'd say third, there have been lots of practical changes in lifestyle for religious communities. Some examples would be working to eliminate single-use plastics. Some people are creating community gardens with neighbors. There's divesting from fossil fuels and investing in renewable energy sources, as well as retrofitting residential buildings using solar and geothermal energy sources. And fourth, over the years, there have been growing efforts to address the root causes of ecological injustice through advocacy and through systemic change. So this includes public statements about the climate emergency, but also lobbying with politicians at all levels on issues as wide-ranging as shale gas extraction, ending fossil fuel subsidies, support for the carbon tax, and calling for a full implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to name a few of the efforts. In addition to that, I'd point to that a number of our congregations are working at the UN as part of a wider civil society body to support the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's just kind of a quick smattering of 4 different, but I think important areas where religious communities have been involved. There's lots happening on many different levels. And, when Laudato Si arrived 5 years ago, it certainly echoed and affirmed this ecological justice work. But at the same time, it offered a powerful synthesis of some of the best ecological insights from many different disciplines. And as Stephen was saying, expressed them in a beautifully written and compelling document. I think just as important, Laudato Si moved this work, this ecological justice work, from the margins of the institutional church right to the center of church life. Just think about, if you're familiar with the document, think about chapter 2 of the Encyclical, where the Pope acknowledges misinterpretations of the Genesis story. You know, for example, he counters the idea that humans were to have dominion over the earth. And instead, he gives a reflection on the Genesis story and explores how a new image of God can awaken us to new understandings of how we're in relationship with God, with earth, with each other. You know, I think about the place in Laudato Si where the Pope talks about God's love as the fundamental moving force in all created things. God's love as the fundamental moving force in all created things. Now that's an image of God, which can move us into right relationship with earth and with all Earth's creatures. It's an image that can begin to heal some of the brokenness in the world today. So now here we are, 5 years later, in the context of COVID-19. I think there's no question that this has been a keenly felt experience of one of the recurring themes in the Encyclical, namely that everything is connected. But there's another powerful line in the Encyclical. It's powerful for me. I believe it was written for a moment such as this. I'm going to shorten it a bit, but I think you'll recognize it. Our goal is to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. So we need to let ourselves become painfully aware of this moment, to let the many different levels of interconnection, of pain and suffering, but also of goodness and insight soak into our bones. I think if we allow ourselves to be painfully aware, we will allow ourselves to be affected by the inequities in our society, which have been so emphasized by this pandemic. You know, and despite that encouraging mantra that we're all in this together, and in some ways we are, but at the same time, we know that the pandemic has had sharply divergent impacts. Just one example, at this point, 30% of lower paid workers have lost their jobs, while 20% of middle-waged workers have lost theirs, and only 1.3% of high-wage earners have lost their job. You know, in addition to that, the vast majority of the lower wage employees are working on the front lines in unsafe working conditions. Or if we think about it on a global scale, the pandemic is expected to create famine in many parts of the world. I saw an analysis from the UN's World Food Program that showed that 300,000 people could starve every single day over the next 3 months. So, like the pandemic, we know that the climate crisis impacts people who are living in economic poverty much more than the wealthy, while also impacting some other species to the point of extinction. So the message in the Encyclical to pay attention to these divergent impacts is, I think, really important. At the same time, the Encyclical's focus on interconnections is more important than ever. This pandemic is a public health issue, which triggered an economic crisis and a debt crisis, primarily because the current economic and financial models leave so many people living in precarious situations. I think our challenge is to seize the crisis moment and to ensure that governments at all different levels are responding to the economic crisis with one eye on the already present climate emergency and the other eye on the need for a new economic model. We need a massive transformation toward a low-carbon, sustainable economy, but one which also at the same time rebuilds lives, promotes equality, and creates resilience for the next crisis, whether it's an economic one, a health one, or a climate crisis. So that's going to mean stronger social protections for everyone and good jobs which acknowledge the value of all workers. So I'm going to finish by saying that for sure, the encyclical speaks directly to this moment, but it's only going to come to life in this moment if Catholics bring it to life. We need to act strongly now, not just individual actions, but also collective actions, which create real systemic change. Thanks.
Thank you, Sister Sue, for that very beautiful reflection. I think you brought a very good reminder that the encyclical has a very deep call to decolonize, and that we really need to pay attention to that if we're going to change deeply the structures in society that create the vulnerabilities that you spoke of, especially in this post-pandemic time that we'll be entering. And also for reminding us some stark statistics of how COVID is impacting the most poor and vulnerable. And like you said, that we have to take very collective actions together. And Joe Gunn, who works for the Voice for Justice Center of the Oblates, has put in the chat box a concrete action that you can take today, everyone who's joining us. There's a letter, Catholics for Climate Action, that will be sent to Prime Minister Trudeau that talks about many of the points that Sister Wilson brought up today. So if you'd like to sign that letter, I'd invite you to do so. And let me just thank you, Sister Sue, and all the religious communities for being such inspiring leaders on climate action and ecological conversion. I think you have much to teach us, so thank you very much. And as we know, the struggle for climate change is very intergenerational, and we've seen youth really come together and take a very strong leadership role in this. And I think many have been very inspired by Laudato Si. And so our next speaker, Rebecca Rathbone, is going to speak to us a bit about that. Rebecca is our animator at Development and Peace for Southwest Ontario. And she's also very involved in the Caritas youth movement and has been very instrumental in help building this movement. So she's going to talk to us a bit about that as well, how Laudato Si is inspiring this global youth movement. So I'll pass it to Rebecca.
Thanks, Kelly. And we have the PowerPoint, is that?
Yeah.
Great. Excellent. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for having me, Kelly, for asking me to speak. It's my great pleasure to be talking to you today about how Laudato Si has inspired young people to take action in terms of caring for creation. Climate change is obviously a matter that definitely concerns us because, you know, action or inaction now is going to have a direct impact on what our lives look like 20, 30, 40 years down the road. Every young person, of course, has their own reason for wanting to get involved in caring for creation. So I won't attempt to say why Laudato Si has resonated with youth, but instead I'm going to just show you some examples of how Laudato Si has inspired youth to take action. And maybe you'll be inspired by them as I am every day, and maybe you can get some good ideas that we can implement here in Canada. So I'll just note too, it's a lot to cover in just 10 minutes. So I'm going to give you a very brief summary of projects that I find interesting, but I have included social media tags at the bottom right of the screen on each side. So you can definitely follow up on people and projects that interest you to learn a little bit more. So if we go to the next slide, I'll start by talking about Laudato Si generation. which is the global youth wing of the Global Catholic Climate Movement. It was launched last year in January at World Youth Day in Panama. And it's structured as a working group that's supported by a GCCM staff person. I'm on this working group to represent Canada. And the purpose, if we go to the next slide, of Laudato Si Generation is to coordinate the eco-justice initiatives of Catholic youth around the world, to provide a sharing platform, to learn from and be inspired by others, to spread the message of Laudato Si among young people and encourage them to take up an eco-spirituality, and of course to bring the voices of young people to the church's ecological mandate. So we do this by meeting regularly as a working group. We organize webinars. For example, we organized one just on Thursday about composting to mark Laudato Si Week. We post regularly on social media. We participate at relevant events such as World Youth Day, of course, and various climate meetings. And of course, we're very active in participating in the Fridays for Future climate strikes as well. And also we promote the general work of the GCCM among young people, especially we've taken up the divestment initiative that they're undergoing right now. And one of our most important initiatives is promoting the Laudato Si Generation Manifesto. I certainly encourage you to, excuse me, to follow up at the website on the screen and read the whole thing. It was presented to Cardinal Tagle at World Youth Day Panama. You can see a photo of that there, who accepted it on behalf of the church. A basic summary is that it includes some commentaries on climate change, especially as it relates to youth, but also some concrete recommendations about how we think the church should take action on climate change, as well as how some policymakers should take action on climate change. And if we go to the next slide, another concrete action that you can take even just today is to support this manifesto by signing the letter at laudatosigeneration.org/letter. So I certainly encourage you to go and do that today. It'll take 2 seconds. Moving on to our Caritas network. One of the reasons, I say this, one of the reasons we can be so proud to be in the Caritas network is because it means that we're in the same network as the young people that I'm about to introduce you to, and I jump at any chance I get to brag about them. So I'm very happy to be able to do that today. Again, this is just a taste of the projects that I'm about to talk to you about, and a taste of just, what the member organizations are doing to support youth to take action on climate justice. So I certainly encourage you to follow them on social media, to get a fuller picture. So let's start our world tour, shall we? We'll start with the Caritas Latin America and Caribbean region. Can we go back? Sorry, nope, back. There we go, okay, great. We'll start with Caritas El Salvador. So they have a program called Jóvenes con Propósito, Youth with Purpose, which is their youth leadership training program, which does partially focus on Laudato Si and caring for creation. So one example of a project that they did was a community cleanup called Action for a Better World, where the local cathedral partnered with high school students who were encouraged to go and do this community cleanup, but also encouraged to post about it on social media to inspire other young people to do the same type of action. The photo beside that is also really interesting. The youth leaders that are part of this program train younger students actually about how to create organic repellents for plants to be used in the gardens of the schools that are involved in the Jóvenes con Propósito program. And the purpose of this is to reduce the consumption of agrochemicals, to raise awareness about this issue from an early age, and also to encourage children to question their parents about the ways that they engage in agriculture. They also have a Laudato Si community leaders program, where they read through Laudato Si together and do trainings about how to disseminate its message in each parish territory. So one of the key strategies that they use is they make more user-friendly versions of Laudato Si, to make it more palatable for participants. And my friend Victor, actually, who works for Caritas El Salvador, uses a specific edition that's geared towards the migrants who he works with in his programs who are living in shelters, and how they specifically can apply its message in their context. So again, making Laudato Si palatable to your specific audience is key here. So we'll move on to Caritas Oceania. Oh, other way. Great, okay, Caritas Oceania. We will hover over Caritas Aotearoa, New Zealand. They actually tried a new idea this year, which they called the Kaitiaki to Share program. It was a creative ideas competition for students of all ages. They ended up getting over 100 submissions from students, and they posted the winner on all of the winners on their website. So again, I certainly encourage you to have a look at that website on the screen there. The winning idea was actually a board game created by a grade 8 student that shows people how they can care for creation in the context of New Zealand. So that was a really interesting creative idea. And again, they had a lot of success with that. And you can see actually more submissions than even the winners. So I'm sure you can certainly be inspired by all of those. We'll move on to Caritas Asia. In Caritas India. So for Laudato Si Week, they created a series of social media posts that in simple terms explained key messages of Laudato Si and gave really easy examples of how young people could get involved. So for example, the Garden of Eden post, they encouraged children to to go out and plant something, which again is a great example of making Laudato Si user-friendly for young people. They also organized a webinar called Youth Reimagining for a New Normal, which had a focus on building back better after COVID-19. But what was really interesting to me was the lineup of panelists which they chose to include, which were a Supreme Court judge, the captain of India's women's basketball team, the executive director of Caritas India, a news anchor, a famous news anchor, the secretary of the Youth Council of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of India, as well as a finalist on the Indian Idol singing competition. So my point here is that they're connecting young people with cool, interesting people, and they're getting cool, interesting people to help them to reach the young people in their communities. And of course, by cool, interesting people, I mean people that young people find cool and interesting. We'll move on to Caritas Mona, so the Middle East and North Africa, to Caritas Lebanon Youth. Anybody who knows me knows that I am a huge fan of Caritas Lebanon. I could do an entire TED talk on how much I love Caritas Lebanon, but that's another webinar for another day. So I'll just say that in their youth programs, they regularly do training workshops on Laudato Si and Catholic social teaching in general. This manifests in action to projects like reforestation projects. They're actually working on a Caritas forest, and one initiative of that is they get people who visit Caritas Lebanon to plant a tree, and they get a tree planted in their name through that program, which is really neat. They also have community gardens. They do a beach cleanup every year around World Water Day. They do community environmental mural projects, and they go into the schools. The youth volunteers go into the schools and talk to younger students about why it's important to care for creation. So again, we have youth leading even younger people, which is great. Again, they do amazing work, so I certainly encourage you to follow them on social media to find out more. Next, we'll head to Caritas Africa, the story from Caritas Kenya, who last year recruited school students to help the Catholic Church in Kenya reach their goal of planting 25 million trees across the country over the course of 2019. So that was 1 million trees per diocese, and they had a lot of success with that program, which was really nice to see. I also encourage you to check out Caritas Africa's Regional Secretariat Facebook page, who did daily reflections over Laudato Si Week to show how different Caritas Africa member organizations were putting Laudato Si into action. Next, we'll hit up Europe, Caritas Europa. Now here, there were two projects that I liked, and I didn't pick one. I chose both of them, so I hope you don't mind. Starting with CAFOD, which is the English and Welsh Caritas member organization, they have a Climate Champions program, which is open to youth aged 18 to 35. It's by application only. They only allow a limited number of participants per year. Some of the initiatives that they do is they train young people how to fundraise, how to meet their local member of parliament, how to participate in a lobby of parliament, and they also do retreats and other training sessions as well for them. Another neat thing that they do is they engage in craftivism, so using crafts and being creative in order to engage in activism. So one thing that they do is they make green hearts, and they have an activity guide for that, which you can actually find on CAFOD's website if you're interested. And they give them to key decision makers to let them know that the time is ticking on climate change. So the other example from Europe that I liked was a program that Caritas Poland runs. It's called Caritas Laudato Si. And in that program, they engage 12 dioceses across the country to organize regular workshops about Laudato Si and the climate crisis. And ultimately, they use this program to animate a network of what they also call Caritas Laudato Si animators, which sounds familiar to the GCCM. Another neat initiative in this, though, is that local initiatives can apply for grants through this program, so to fund their projects. So young people can create their own local projects to spread the knowledge of Laudato Si, and Caritas Poland will provide the resources for them to actually put their ideas into action, which is really nice. Okay, and now our last stop on our world tour is bringing it home to Caritas North America. I hope you don't mind, I took 2 examples as well. Of course, I can't not talk about development and peace. Our youth members do amazing work, and they're key to running successful campaigns every year. You all know that, of course. But I wanted to share one new initiative that we tried this year that was really successful, which was a Laudato Si song. So it has a very simple chorus. The words are just Laudato Si, O mi Signore, but then we got students to work together to write their own verses about caring for creation, and then we all sang the song and danced together. So it was a new creative way to engage young people and to encourage young people to be creative. We ran it with all of our students at our Southwestern Ontario workshops and did it at the When Faith Meets Pedagogy conference, and it was a huge hit and a lot of fun. So the other member of Caritas North America, there's only 3. There's us, Catholic Relief Services and Catholic Charities USA. So I wanted to share an example of how Catholic Relief Services engages young people, and it's through their CRS University program. So CRS partners with 141 universities across the states to engage in prayer, education, and action on social and ecological justice issues. By engaging students, it can range from just engaging students to take part in actions to actually formal relationships, formal institutional partnerships between the university and Catholic Relief Services that combines, mobilizing students, but also with supporting faculty and supporting programs within the university to implement, Catholic social teachings in their courses and their programs. So one example of one of their CRS University campaigns is called I Am Climate Change, and it's part of a series where the tagline is I am the cause, I am the solution. So they show students how, the way we live here causes these issues, but also trains them about how they can take action to create solutions, and climate change has been a really successful example of one of those campaigns. So, I'm sorry for moving so fast, the world is a very big place. But I will wrap it up just by saying something that I always like to say, especially when I'm talking to young people, which is, we always hear that youth are the future, but I wholeheartedly disagree with that, because I say that youth is the present, right? We're here now and we want to take action now, and we should be treated as if we are here now, not, that we're going to be actually making these contributions in the future. And if we embrace this concept, I think we're going to make a lot of headway in terms of moving the needle on the climate crisis, because youth really are effective agents of change. For many reasons, but 2 main ones that I've seen, especially in my work with Caritas Youth. First of all, youth are really action-oriented and decisive. I've seen this by working in these global networks. They don't waste time, well, not waste, I shouldn't say. they don't spend time questioning themselves necessarily. They do analyze the situation, but ultimately they come to a decision and they take that action quickly. A lot of people were amazed at how much the Caritas Youth Network was able to accomplish in such a short time, but it was because they are so action oriented and decisive. The second is because they're creative by nature, right? And young people are always looking for an outlet for their creativity. So the same old has gotten us into this mess of the climate crisis, and it's certainly not going to get us out. So we need people who think differently, and that's what young people do. So the best scenario is for young people to learn from the wisdom of older generations and be open to that, of course. But at the same time, older generations who are in positions of power certainly need to make space for youth to do their thing. And that's, now we have Christus Vivit, which is the apostolic exhortation that Pope Francis released last year, which calls the church to do exactly this. So if we can get that balance, I think that we're gonna be good. So I will finish there and make way for Agnes. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rebecca. I think you really gave us some very concrete examples of how youth are taking action around the world. And thank you for bringing in that power analysis at the end, because I think it's a very important point that again is brought up very much in Laudato Si, in terms of we, or those in positions of power, need to give way to those who can show us different ways of doing things and be inspired by other ways of thinking, mind views. And as you just showed, youth can do that in very effective ways. So thank you very much for taking us around the world. And just for those of you who may not be too familiar with Caritas, Caritas is a federation of 165 Catholic organizations that do humanitarian work and development work and work on social justice in their countries and with their local communities, and are building up this wonderful youth movement. So now we'll go to our last speaker, who is Agnes Richard. Agnes is the coordinator of the Global Catholic Climate Movement for the chapter here in Canada. GCCM was a very specific response to Laudato Si and was born out of as a response, in a way, when Laudato Si was published and in the lead up to the COP21 talks that resulted in the Paris Agreement. So the Canadian chapter is quite new, but is already doing some really great work. So I will pass it to Agnes to tell us a bit about the work of GCCM and GCCM Canada.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And thank you to everyone who's spending their beautiful Saturday afternoon to be part of this webinar. It's great to have all of you here with us. And thank you also to Stephen, Sister Susan, and Rebecca for the inspirational words that you told us about, and showing us that the momentum from Laudato Si is really growing. In paragraph of 231 in Laudato Si, Pope Francis said, along with the importance of little everyday gestures, social love moves us to devise larger strategies to halt environmental degradation and to encourage a culture of care, which permeates all of society. When we feel that God is calling us to intervene with others in these social dynamics, we should realize that this too is part of our spirituality, which is an exercise of charity and as such matures and sanctifies us. Kelly mentioned the global celebrations in honor of Laudato Si Week. And these have brought us together all over the world and shown us how that we can intervene while practicing social distance. And while COVID-19 also teaches us that without any doubt, we are all interconnected. Is there a way to bring up the slide presentation? Thank you, and we can go right to slide 2, please. Great. The Global Catholic Climate Movement Canadian chapter began during the season of creation last year. And it's a chapter of the much larger Global Catholic Climate Movement that both Kelly and Rebecca referred to. which is also quite young, only 5 years old. So GCCM is celebrating a 5th anniversary along with Laudato Si. This graphic gives you the nuts and bolts of how we are linked together within GCCM Canada. But to state who we are more simply, the international body of GCCM, Faith in the Common Good, a national interfaith non-for-profit, the GCCM Canada Advisory Circle, and there are actually 12 people on that advisory group now, and myself are committed to working with each of you to continue the work of caring for creation and raising awareness around Laudato Si. We hope this will be a reciprocal relationship where we can work together in faith to support each other, grow in understanding and solidarity with Indigenous defenders of the gifts of our Creator, and achieve ever-increasing influence in the public sphere to bring about the changes needed to ensure a healthy future. And the next slide, please. Now, isn't this a happy-looking bunch? Some of you might recognize some of these people. I'm blessed with a truly talented and passionate group of advisors, some working in diocesan offices, some connected with Faith, the Common Good, some are professors at schools of theology or are working with religious communities, and some are Indigenous elders themselves. While they support the work that I do, they are also able to help you with any specific questions that relate to their particular fields of expertise. The next slide, please. Based on the model of the international Global Catholic Climate Movement, the Canadian chapter will share Canadian-based Catholic and partner resources around these 4 pillars of engagement. These guide us from personal contemplations of our relationship with the world around us and our spiritual place within it, to considerations about how we can change our lifestyles and the way we work in community. GCCM Canada recognizes the necessity of learning what we can do to support Indigenous defenders of creation. And this component, a little bit different from the international movement, is something that we focus on but undertake with humility, knowing that we will sometimes make mistakes. But collectively, we will strive to keep learning and finding ways to be helpful to each other. These phases of learning and mutual evolution will lead us to assist with the transformation of our larger society and common home. And the next slide, please. GCCM Canada provides several avenues for us to work together through newsletters 3 or 4 times a year, webinars, a dedicated GCCM Canada Google group where we can chat amongst each other, share ideas, frustrations, news about avenues to pursue to reach larger audiences of Catholics. And then we have our Global Catholic Climate Movement Canada website. On that website, you can find recordings to 3 webinars that we have undertaken in our first year. The first one, which was part of our launch activities, was called Defending the Defenders. And it talked about the connection between what Pope Francis is saying globally through Laudato Si to very specific circumstances and actions that we could take right here at home in Canada. We recognize that here within our own country, we have a lot of work to do. The second webinar was called Listening to Youth, and Rebecca was part of that one as well. The third webinar, which was just a little earlier this week, was called Women of Faith Eco-Leaders. And again, we looked at some of the documents that were generated out of the Synod for the Amazon, and how those documents and Pope Francis' reflections can be part of discussions, again, here in our own Canadian situation, and specifically with our biome here, in protection of our boreal forests and lands and waters. Next slide, please. This is a snapshot of the header page for our website, and you'll notice that it lives within the larger website of Faith in the Common Good, because they have generously given us space to use their platforms. Through the support of their executive director, Michelle Singh, and one of their senior advisors, Lucy Cummings, who also sits on the GCCM Canada Advisory Circle, and with the assistance of the communications coordinator, Katrine Hadley-Daly, GCCM Canada has a strong and experienced team to facilitate its operations. And at the bottom of the page there is the address that will take you specifically to GCCM Canada's website. The next slide, please. GCCM Canada plans to promote 4 focal points for our advocacy suggestions. They each hold equal weight in our understanding. To enshrine the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into Canadian law goes hand in hand with the petition that I'll ask you to take part in towards the end of my presentation. Strengthening the investigative power of Canada's Ombudsman for responsible enterprise and enacting Canadian laws that will hold our multinational corporations to account for human rights abuses and environmental degradations around the world supports the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'll just mention that GCCM Canada, being new and rather young, we're not able at this time to create campaigns of our own. While we highlight certain advocacy points that we want to focus on, we will hold up and support and spread the news on campaigns that are worthwhile pursuing that other organizations are engaged in, such as the Joint Ecological Ministry or the Citizens for Public Justice or to Development and Peace. So GCCM Canada strives to be a connector between good work that's already being done and Catholics who are wondering how they can become engaged. Okay, the next slide, please. So this is just a quick, very quick and small snapshot of some of the historical Indigenous actions that have taken place and that we can help educate our Canadian population about if they aren't aware of those. Next slide, please. So a just transition is especially important right now as we see our economy completely topsy-turvy through COVID-19. I mentioned the Citizens for Public Justice, and they and many others are writing to our members of Parliament to ask for a just transition for all of society, but to include the environment and how we move forward. We don't want to go back to business as usual as it was before, because that business as usual, we can see, is not working for everyone. And as a society where some are left behind is the society that doesn't work. Next slide, please. There are people of faith and Catholics across the country who are supportive of a just transition. This is a group of ladies from my hometown in Caledonia who took part in the Citizens for Public Justice campaign last year. And we know that even in provinces where the economy is closely tied to energy, there are people there too who are yearning for a shift in the balance of how those economies support the people living there. And GCCM Canada wants to support what they're doing as well. Next slide, please. Divestment from the fossil fuel industry and supporting infrastructure is a very urgent call from Pope Francis, and one that has strong assistance from the international global Catholic climate movement with tools, templates for engagement, and celebrations of the many Catholic institutions worldwide that have chosen this path. In fact, just this week, in Laudato Si week, another 24 Catholic organizations around the world have chosen to divest their savings from the fossil fuel sector. And you can find that information through the website link that I've given here. The next slide, please. This is truly a good news story, divestment, and then shifting what is divested into renewable sources of energy and support for people. It makes strong economic sense too at a time when we recognize that these forms of investment will continue to lose value. GCCM Canada offers assistance and resources through our website to any organization wanting to explore and implement this powerful approach to caring for our creation. Slide 3, please. 13, please. Finally, support for a national price on carbon. Sister Stu mentioned that the religious communities have been supporting this call for many, many years. GCCM Canada takes up that call, and through the website, again, we have suggestions on how people can engage with that. It's closely linked to our second advocacy point on a just transition. Current discussions in this area are shadowed by getting our economy started again. However, efforts to remind our political leaders that policies to protect the environment and a healthy future should never come second to the interests of corporations where profit motive and not care for people and the planet is the driving force. Next slide, please. GCCM Canada is now 9 months old. We've built some strong partnerships already, and we continue to build connections and partnerships with other Catholic and other faith-based organizations with similar goals. Our combined efforts are making a difference in Canada, and we will work to make our voices even louder. I also like to thank the organizations that have supported GCCM Canada financially: Scharper Missions, the Sisters of St. Joseph's in Toronto and Canada, Our Lady's Missionaries, Ursuline Sisters in Chatham, Ontario, and the Sisters of Notre Dame in Montreal have all supported GCCM Canada in our first year. Okay, next slide, please. Now, Joe Gunn mentioned already the Catholics United for Climate Action. I believe the petition is still open to receive people's names in support of this letter to Justin Trudeau. Joe Gunn let us know that over 600 people across the country have signed this, and it can be signed as individuals or as organizations. The more the better. So as soon as this webinar wraps up, look up this please. It's Catholics United for Climate Action. The second is a petition to the House of Parliament. It's sponsored by a member of Parliament from, let's see, from Edmonton, I believe. This is to request that the Canadian Ombudsperson for Responsible Enterprise, which is the organization, or which was not an organization, but it was intended to be a voice for people around the world who have been wrongly treated by Canadian companies in their countries, whether pollution spills or human rights abuses. This petition is asking to give that ombudsperson more teeth, more ability to investigate, and also calls on the Canadian government to put laws in place that will hold our Canadian corporations working abroad to account for the things that they do. And the last slide. This is how you can reach the Global Catholic Climate Movement. And when you go to that webpage, you'll also find my email address there. You can reach out to me at any time. We have regular newsletters, and our Google group is becoming very active. It has highlighted a couple of advocacy actions this past spring that have been successful. So I invite you to investigate and to join us. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Agnes. It's really great to see the different advocacy avenues that GCCM is working on, and thank you for promoting those petitions. Development and Peace is also promoting the petition for the ombudsperson, which, as Agnes mentioned, is sponsored by Heather McPherson, an MP in Edmonton. So I encourage you to sign it as a House of Commons petition. It will be presented in Parliament once it's reached enough signatures. So please go and sign that. We have some time now for some questions. There's already a few that have come in. And just to let you know, we'll be showing a few slides during the question period to help inspire people. So we'll start with this first one, which is directed to Stephen. And it says, do you think the COVID-19 pandemic can potentially lift up public thinking and political policies to implement a human security agenda on climate and nuclear weapons particularly, or is the pandemic going to lead to more policies where governments focus more on self-survival? Can humanity grasp that this is a transformational moment in history?
Doug, thank you for that question. And Doug, as many of you know, is a premier representative of peace in Canada from a faith perspective. So it's an honor to have you aboard here, Doug. The simple answer is, I don't know. I mean, I think this is it's an aspiration. One thing that I think there is an opening for, though, is the role of government as the curator of the common good. With the collapse of our economy, we're now seeing the falsehood of a particular laissez-faire approach that thought that the market could handle these things. It reminds one of the joke, how many laissez-faire economists does it take to screw in a light bulb? Well, the answer is none. They wait for the invisible hand of the marketplace to do it. But what we're seeing is the invisible hand of the marketplace is unable to deal with the COVID crisis, a deadly invisible hand of a pandemic. So this appeal to government has opened up certain things now that were impossible or marginalized. For example, in Toronto and perhaps other cities, advocates have said, why not take empty spaces, empty hotel rooms, and provide full service housing and services for homeless? Well, that's impossible. We can't do that. Well, it's now being done. Advocates have said for years, why can't we close city streets on the weekends for pedestrians and cyclists and children? Oh no, that would interfere with the commercial flow of traffic, etc. Well, lo and behold, that's being done across the country. The notion of a basic universal income, again, marginalized and pilloried and unplugged here in Ontario. Well, the Pope is now calling for this, and Spain is moving on that as other people are. So as we see a collapse of business as usual, we are being invited to see government not as an enemy, as it has been demonized by many on the conservative side of the spectrum since 1980 in particular, but as a purveyor, curator of the common good, which includes our biotic communities as well as our human communities. So this is an aspiration and an aperture. And sorry, Doug, I can't say any further than that about what might happen here, except that as these excellent presentations of the members on this panel have shown, this is happening from the youth through the faith in the common good and the wonderful activities that all have talked about. It's changing. This culture is changing, and this is exciting. So thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Stephen. I just want to remind everyone that if you have a question, to please put it in the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Also, I just want to mention, Beatrice says she's joining us from Connecticut in the US. So anyone who's joining us from outside of Canada, thank you for being with us today. It's really nice to have some people globally with us as well. And the next question from John, I think I'll ask Sister Sue to answer. He asked that government leaders in Alberta, Newfoundland, and Labrador are seeking federal government support for the oil industry to help ensure jobs. How can we convince government leaders and citizens in those provinces who are worried about jobs and the economy that a different approach must be taken?
Yeah, that's a really important question, especially at this moment in Canadian politics. And I think one of the best things we can do is to try not to get caught in the polarized debate. Especially I think the Premier of Alberta is really trying to frame this in terms of, either you're for Alberta and you're for fossil fuels, or you're against us and you're denying us after all these years that we've contributed to the Canadian economy. So I think this is an important moment for us as activists, that as the question points out, governments at all levels are right now making decisions about what they will do with the stimulus dollars that are going to come out. And so what we need to be doing is to be kind of pushing that conversation at all levels of government. So, let's get in there and be talking to our MPs, talking to our MPPs, talking to our local city councilors, and come to them with concrete ideas of how we can start to rebuild a new kind of economy that is low carbon. And it's not just about the shift from fossil fuels to green energy, although that's important. But this is a moment where it's become really clear that we need to rebuild the caring economy. So what we do with childcare, with elder care, with support for people with disabilities, if we can move into this moment and create supports there, those are low carbon activities. They're things that everybody all across the country has seen the need for. And so we can begin to reframe the debate that way. We can also look to the people in, whether it's Newfoundland or Alberta or anywhere in between. There are lots of people in those provinces who are seeing the need to diversify their economies and to join in those conversations and support those conversations. So I think there's lots to be done, and it needs to be done kind of right now, even though we can only do it by Zoom or telephone calls or letters.
Thank you, Sister Sue. And yes, I think it's very important that we look at the reason why we always say a just transition, so that everyone is included in that and no one is left behind. Dylan asks if Development and Peace or anyone else in the church has looked into the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas. I can answer that just very briefly by saying that Development and Peace works with many peasant organizations, particularly in Latin America and Asia, in Africa as well. And for those organizations, it's a very important declaration because it leads them to have certain rights. And in the work that Development and Peace does and the support we give, one of the reasons why we really try to support movements is that it connects people and it makes it easier for them once they receive trainings on their rights to then advocate for those rights with their local governments. So for instance, in Brazil, many of the organizations we work with have been advocating for access to land, looking at support for local and family agriculture and how to make that sustainable and a dignified way of life. So that's something that we do work on more through the local organizations we work with in the Global South. There's a question from Webb, or Anne Grant, sorry, to Stephen, who is wondering if you can suggest a book, Stephen, that will inspire, continue to help connect the spirit of creation and love.
It's always great when your oldest sister asks a question, because no matter what you answer, she's still got to love you. What I'm going to say, Anne, is Laudato Si, on care for our common home. I've read this twice, and you know Mary Jo Letty of Romero House, dear friend and amazing Canadian spiritual thinker. She reads this, or has, as a spiritual meditation, as well as a theological, philosophical meditation. This book is absolutely rich, and I gain something each time I go into it. So dwelling with this and making it part of daily reading, I think is very fruitful. So that would be my quick answer to that question. And it's available free online. Many publications have issued it, et cetera, any publishers, but it is available online for free as well. So that would be my first start. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Stephen. And I have to say this, this webinar today has really inspired me to also, I think, go back to Laudato Si and give it another read through. I feel like there's so much more to discover in there. So I think we'll wrap it up with Peter asked a good question that I think can lead to each of you giving a final remark, and also I'll combine it with Sister Priscilla Solomon's question. So Peter asks, you've given us a very solid foundation today to see and to judge. So he's asking, what would you suggest, each of you, as a practical, concrete suggestion of how we can act? And then Sister Solomon asks, how do you sustain your energy and hope and continue to educate and lead others? So maybe each of you could give a response to those questions and any other final remarks you'd like to give. So maybe I'll start with Rebecca.
Okay. Well, to answer the second question first, I am really sustained when I, engage with other young people around the world, especially around the Caritas network, to see what they're doing. The incredible work that they do, and the fact that they don't get tired is really what energizes and inspires me. And in terms of concrete action to take, I said it at the end of my other of my presentation, but I really think that having that intergenerational spirit in any initiative to help to care for creation is really important. Creating that space where young people can learn from older generations and draw on their wisdom and expertise, but at the same time having the older generations be humble enough to listen to the younger people as well, and make space for them to contribute now while we're young, not in the future. I think that that's really, really key.
Thank you, Rebecca. Now we'll go to Agnes.
I think I'd like to echo what Rebecca said. The things that energize me are the people that I meet. And I know that at this time, meeting each other face to face is not something that we can do, but there are a lot of platforms and a lot of ways of connecting with people who are doing this work. And they're all wonderful, passionate people. And Pope Francis reminds us too that any one of our individual actions do have an impact, but they have even more impact when we are working together. The other thing that I would like to suggest that echoes what Sister Sue said is talking to members of Parliament. They are obliged to listen to the things that we say. Elizabeth May reminded us that do not for a minute assume that they know more than you do about something on a topic that you're passionate about, because more often than not, it's the other way around. We can educate them. And lastly, one of the best supports for members of parliament is for them to be able to say in the House of Commons that my constituents say they want this. That's us. So it's up to us to tell them what we want. And they are obliged to work towards those things. So we shouldn't be afraid to speak to members of parliament in whatever format works best, letters, emails. I don't know if they're doing conference calls, but that would be fantastic if they could do that right now too.
Thank you so much, Agnes. That's a very good practical way of taking action, is contacting your MP. Stephen, I'll pass it to you.
Well, thank you. I just want to underscore all the excellent suggestions that have been made. And I began to think of this under these PP principles. So the first PP principle, personal and political. So our actions have to be both, as many of the speakers have intimated. And that's interesting because we interface with the environment, with the climate, every step we take, every breath we take in our personal life, our social life, our faith life, our friendship lives. We are interacting. So there's personal change and political change. So those have to be integrated. So if you're thinking, okay, I'm going to look at my personal inventory, I'm going to compost, I'm going to recycle, I'm not going to use bottled waters, etc. Great, I'm spending time on that. I've been trying to spend as much time on my political outreach, whether it is writing to parliamentarians, contacting them, organizing within the university, etc. The second PP principle for me is progress, not perfection. We're not going to achieve the perfect scenario here, and we shouldn't self-flagellate if we don't do it. And we shouldn't lose hope. But if we are making progress, that's important. And to address Sister Priscilla Solomon's wonderful question, it's great that you're aboard, Sister Priscilla, who has been such an inspiration for me over the years. I remember a question that you posed in an article that you and other Indigenous community members will ask, what waters are you from? And during this COVID crisis, one thing that has helped keep me spiritually lubricated is discovering Lake Ontario. Going to that waterfront pre-dawn, watching the dawn come over Lake Ontario, sometimes with my wife, sometimes with my wife and son, sometimes alone, and reconnecting with this amazing Great Lake that Toronto has kind of turned its back on, and that I had not been in relationship to as I should be until this COVID crisis. And this is the deep interconnection with the energies of nature that not only the Pope is alluding to, but great thinkers who have helped us, such as Thomas Berry, the cultural historian, etc. That we need the energies of the earth as much as the social traditions of our justice traditions and our transformative action. Connecting with our waters is a key element of keeping our spiritual life supple, I think. So thank you for that question, Sister Solomon.
Thank you, Stephen. And we'll end with you, Sister Sue.
Okay, thanks. I'll echo the others in saying that it's the wonderful people that I work with who give me energy, and I think I'm particularly impressed by the commitment and the savvy and the intelligence of youth in the environmental and the ecological justice movement. I think that's a powerful energy right now. And just one more thing, I would say that this is our generation's moment. Our society is at a crossroads. Our economy is at a crossroads. And if we can take hold of this moment and shape it in a way for greater equity and greater care for the earth, we can actually shift what happens on this world. And we cannot rely on governments to do the right thing. So it's up to us to step into this moment and to begin to shape it in the direction that will give life to all the inhabitants of this planet, because there will be lots of other voices talking to governments. We need to make sure that ours is the most compelling.
Thank you, Sister Sue. And I think that connects a bit with a comment that Yvette Zarwani put, who is just reminding us that we can't be naive, you know, that we have to make sure that we're realistic in the actions we take. And as you mentioned, Sister Sue, there are other very powerful voices speaking to governments. So we have to make our voice as compelling as possible also. So I want to thank our 4 panelists. I think this has been an incredibly rich discussion today. This webinar will be available on the Development and Peace website and our YouTube channel. I'd also like to mention that as Sister Sue mentioned in her presentation, the impacts of COVID could potentially be quite devastating on many vulnerable communities in the global south. And Development and Peace is quite concerned for those people. So if ever you can, please make a donation. You can go to our website at www.devp.org, and you can make an online donation there. And on the slide, you can also see that you can make a check to us and send it to Montreal. We can now process checks since we can receive mail, and also you can call us at 1-888-664-3387. And you might want to consider becoming a monthly donor. It's one of the best ways to support our work throughout the year and really help those who need it most. So if you can, please consider making a donation. So before we go, I think I'll just end on some final words from Laudato Si from Pope Francis, who says, "I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all." And I really feel that we've started that dialogue today. I think it's been going on for 5 years now in many ways, but this is a key moment to relaunch that dialogue, and I think we've done that today. So I wish all of you a wonderful rest of day. Go enjoy outside nature, reconnect, and reflect on some of the many wise words that were shared with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care.